The Battle of Pomerania in early 1945 was the result of overlapping strategic imperatives, political pressures, and military circumstances that developed as the Second World War reached its final phase in Europe. To understand why this campaign unfolded as it did, one must examine the conditions that preceded it, the interests of the opposing sides, and the wider geopolitical context of the war in Central and Eastern Europe. By January 1945, the Soviet Red Army had achieved one of its greatest advances of the war. The Vistula-Oder offensive, launched on 12th January, had driven German forces westward more than 500 kilometers, reaching the Oder River by the end of the month. Soviet troops now stood less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. This rapid advance created opportunities, but also exposed vulnerabilities. The flanks of the Soviet spearheads were thinly held, and large German forces remained in Pomerania to the north and in Silesia to the south. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front were positioned for the eventual assault on Berlin, but their supply lines were stretched and their northern flank remained unsecured. For the German High Command, the situation was equally critical. Army Group Vistula, Heeresgruppe Weichsel, had been hastily created in late January to organize resistance in northern Germany and Pomerania. It included remnants of the Second Army, the newly raised 11th SS Panzer Army, and various Volkssturm and police formations. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, was appointed commander of the army group, though his lack of military expertise and the chaotic condition of the forces under his control limited effectiveness. Pomerania itself, stretching between the Oder and the Baltic, contained important ports such as Stettin, Szczecin, Kolberg, Kołobrzeg, and Danzig, Gdańsk. Holding the region was critical for securing communications with East Prussia and maintaining access to the Baltic evacuation routes through which hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and civilians were retreating westward. The civilian dimension was central to the preconditions of the battle. As the Red Army advanced, millions of German civilians fled from East Prussia, West Prussia, and Pomerania toward the Baltic ports in one of the largest refugee movements of the war. Harsh winter conditions, congested roads, and limited transportation meant that many civilians were caught between retreating German units and the advancing Soviets. The evacuation by sea, known as Operation Hannibal, depended on ports such as Gotenhafen, Gdynia, and Danzig remaining in German hands. The defense of Pomerania was therefore not only a military necessity, but also directly tied to the fate of hundreds of thousands of civilians attempting to escape westward. On the Soviet side, the decision to turn attention to Pomerania before advancing on Berlin reflected both military logic and political concerns. Joseph Stalin insisted that no risk be taken that could jeopardize the main offensive into the German capital. The presence of German forces north of the Oder posed a potential threat of counterattacks against the left flank of Zhukov's forces. Moreover, coordination with the Polish First Army, which had been reformed under Soviet sponsorship, gave the operation additional political significance. Securing Pomerania meant placing much of future Western Poland under Soviet and Polish control before the arrival of Western Allied forces. Militarily, both sides faced challenges of readiness. The Red Army's winter offensives had consumed large amounts of ammunition, fuel, and manpower. Units were fatigued, and equipment losses had been significant, even though reserves were available. German forces in Pomerania were a mixture of experienced divisions withdrawn from the Eastern Front, newly raised Volksgrenadier units, and SS formations with varying levels of cohesion. The 11th SS Panzer Army under Felix Steiner, though theoretically powerful, lacked the tanks and supplies necessary to operate as an effective striking force. Intelligence on both sides reflected uncertainty. The Soviets underestimated the extent of German forces regrouping in Pomerania, while the Germans misjudged the scale of Soviet reserves available for the northern campaign. Public sentiment in both Germany and the Soviet Union framed the coming battle in stark terms. For Germans, propaganda presented Pomerania as part of the Fortress Reich to be defended to the last, emphasizing the need to hold open escape routes for civilians and preserve access to the Baltic. For Soviet citizens and soldiers, official narratives emphasized the inevitability of victory and the importance of eliminating German strongholds that could threaten the drive to Berlin. Both sides thus entered the battle with high stakes. For the Germans, survival and evacuation. For the Soviets, security and momentum toward the war's final objective. The conditions at the beginning of 1945 therefore created a volatile situation in which strategic necessity and humanitarian crisis converged. Pomerania became the focal point of overlapping goals: the Soviet need to secure its northern flank before the Berlin offensive, the German effort to hold evacuation corridors and resist encirclement, and the civilians' desperate struggle to escape advancing front lines. These preconditions set the stage for one of the last major campaigns on the Eastern Front, a contest fought not only across battlefields, but also within shattered cities, coastal ports, and refugee-choked roads. The opening phase of the Battle of Pomerania unfolded in February 1945, as Soviet forces sought to address the exposed northern flank left after their rapid drive to the Oder. The Soviet High Command ordered Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front to move into Pomerania from the east, supported by elements of Zhukov's First Belarusian Front pressing from the south. The initial Soviet objective was to cut off German forces holding positions around Danzig, Elbing, and Graudenz, thereby eliminating the possibility of counterattacks against the Soviet thrust toward Berlin. On the German side, Army Group Vistula had only just been organized. Heinrich Himmler nominally held command, but in practice, operational control lay in the hands of professional officers, such as General Walter Weiss of the Second Army and SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner of the newly formed 11th SS Panzer Army. The German defense in Pomerania rested on hastily constructed lines along rivers and towns, reinforced by remnants of divisions retreating from East Prussia. Many units were under strength. Reports indicated divisions that once numbered 12,000, 15,000 men now fielded fewer than 5,000, with significant shortages of tanks and artillery. Nonetheless, they occupied a region of forests, rivers, and marshes that naturally favored the defender. The first clashes came as Rokossovsky's forces advanced from East Prussia in late January and early February, pushing into the area around Graudenz on the Vistula River. Soviet 65th and 70th Armies forced crossings and encircled the city, trapping German defenders. Graudenz fell after heavy fighting, with approximately 1,000 German troops surrendering or destroyed, and this marked the initial breach into Pomerania's defensive belt. Soviet forces then pivoted westward, aiming for Neustetten and the approaches to Stettin, while additional units moved toward the Baltic coast to sever German communications with East Prussia. Civilian populations were directly caught in these early moves. As Soviet troops approached towns like Schneidemühl and Köslin, streams of refugees attempted to escape toward Kolberg and Danzig. Columns of horse-drawn carts, civilians on foot, and scattered military convoys clogged the roads. Severe winter weather added to the chaos, with temperatures below freezing and snowstorms reducing mobility. The German authorities attempted to maintain order through evacuation directives, but in many places civilians left on their own initiative, fearing encirclement. German command tried to counter the Soviet advance with localized counterattacks. Steiner's 11th SS Panzer Army launched several strikes near Stargard and Arnswalde in mid-February. These involved elements of the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, the 4th SS Polizei Division, and remnants of Wehrmacht formations. In one of the more significant counterattacks, German units relieved the garrison at Arnswald temporarily, evacuating around 3,000 troops and civilians. However, the relief effort consumed resources and failed to halt the overall Soviet advance. The Soviets quickly re-encircled the town, which fell after renewed assaults. The command structure on both sides shaped the course of the early fighting. While Himmler struggled to exercise coherent control over Army Group Vistula, the Red Army operated under a more unified system, with Rokossovsky directing coordinated movements across multiple armies. At the same time, Soviet logistics were under strain, with long supply routes stretching back to the Vistula, and the need to move ammunition and fuel across devastated territory. German defensive positions, though undermanned, managed to delay the Soviets at several points, especially along river lines, buying time for the continued evacuation of civilians and military personnel through Baltic ports. By the end of February 1945, the opening phase of the Pomeranian campaign had set the tone for what was to follow. Soviet forces had achieved penetrations across the Vistula and into the heart of Pomerania, but German counterattacks showed that even depleted formations could mount local resistance. Civilians were already experiencing the consequences of mass displacement, food shortages, and bombardments. The initial engagements revealed both the determination of German commanders to hold evacuation corridors and the Soviet insistence on neutralizing the northern flank before launching the final drive on Berlin. The stage was thus set for the larger operations and crises that would soon engulf the region. The strategic goals and planning behind the Battle of Pomerania reflected both the immediate tactical needs of the front and the broader political considerations of early 1945. For the Soviet Union, the central issue was the security of the Berlin Axis. After the spectacular progress of the Vistula-Oder offensive, the Soviet spearheads had reached the Oder by the end of January, but their flanks remained vulnerable. To the north, German forces still controlled large parts of Pomerania and West Prussia, stretching from the Vistula to the Baltic coast. The Stavka, the Soviet High Command, insisted that this salient be eliminated before the final assault on Berlin could be launched. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front was given the primary responsibility for this task. His forces included the 2nd Shock, 49th, 65th, 70th, and 19th Armies, supported by the 2nd Guards Tank Army and the Polish First Army. Altogether, the front counted more than 600,000 men, approximately 8,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and over 1,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. Coordination with Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front was critical, as Soviet planners intended to apply pressure both from the east and the south, gradually compressing German forces in Pomerania into isolated pockets along the Baltic. The German strategic goals were shaped by necessity rather than initiative. Army Group Vistula, formally created on the 24th of January 1945, was tasked with holding Pomerania and defending the approaches to Berlin. Heinrich Himmler, its nominal commander, lacked the military experience to shape coherent plans, leaving operational decisions to senior officers like General Walter Weiss and SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner. Their objectives were threefold: to maintain control of the Baltic ports, to allow continued evacuation of soldiers and civilians through Operation Hannibal, to delay Soviet advances and buy time for reinforcing the Oder defenses, and to preserve a continuous front line that could prevent encirclement of northern German forces. In practice, German planning was constrained by shortages of manpower and materiel. The 2nd Army and 11th SS Panzer Army were under strength, with many formations reduced to Kampfgruppen of a few hundred men. The 11th SS Panzer Army was intended to function as a mobile striking force, but its armored units were incomplete, many divisions lacking even half of their authorized tanks. Logistics were equally problematic. Fuel stocks were critically low, artillery ammunition was limited, and the transport system was overwhelmed by the refugee crisis. Nevertheless, German commanders sought to concentrate their remaining forces around key cities such as Stettin, Stargard, Kolberg, and Danzig, which served as anchor points for defensive lines. The Soviet plan relied heavily on coordination and overwhelming firepower. Rokossovsky intended to launch a pincer movement. His armies would drive westward from East Prussia and across the Vistula toward Pomerania's central sector, while Zhukov's formations advanced northward from the Oder. The goal was to cut the German forces into segments, isolating them in coastal strongholds that could then be reduced one by one. The Polish First Army was assigned a politically symbolic role, advancing on its future national territory and participating in the capture of coastal cities. Propaganda played a role in shaping expectations. German broadcasts emphasized the necessity of defending the Reich's eastern shield, portraying Pomerania as a critical barrier to invasion. Soviet propaganda, in turn, framed the campaign as both a military necessity and a liberation of Polish lands, highlighting the participation of Polish forces. Among civilians, both German and Polish, these narratives were overshadowed by immediate survival. Germans sought evacuation routes, while Poles living under occupation anticipated both the arrival of Soviet forces and the uncertainties of post-war administration. Miscalculations were evident on both sides. Soviet intelligence underestimated the persistence of German resistance, assuming that Army Group Vistula was too weak and disorganized to pose serious problems. This led to an initial underestimation of German counterattacks, such as the relief of Arnswald. Conversely, German planners overestimated their ability to mount a decisive counterstroke with Steiner's SS units, despite shortages of tanks, fuel, and air support. Both sides, therefore, entered the campaign with strategic objectives that clashed with the realities of their available resources. The planning phase of the Battle of Pomerania revealed the contrasting approaches of two collapsing and advancing powers. The Soviets prepared a systematic, large-scale operation designed to eliminate threats to their main offensive, backed by numerical superiority and logistical concentration. The Germans, pressed by desperation, focused on delaying actions, evacuation, and the symbolic defense of fortified cities. This clash of objectives would soon unfold in a series of bloody engagements across towns, forests, and coastal strongholds, where strategy met the harsh realities of terrain, weather, and human endurance. The first engagements of the Battle of Pomerania began in early February 1945 and quickly revealed the character of the campaign. A series of hard-fought clashes in towns, forests, and river crossings, where Soviet attempts to advance met determined German rearguards trying to hold escape corridors open. The fighting reflected both sides' priorities. For the Red Army, the aim was to push rapidly westward and seal off German positions before they could regroup. For the Germans, the immediate goal was to buy time to evacuate civilians, time to organize stronger defenses closer to the Oder, and time to delay the Soviet timetable for the drive on Berlin. The city of Graudenz, situated on the Vistula, became one of the first major objectives. Encircled by Rokossovsky's 65th and 70th armies in late January, the city was defended by elements of the German Second Army. The defenders, numbering about 15,000 men, including Wehrmacht, Volkssturm, and police units, resisted for nearly 2 weeks. Soviet artillery pounded the city, while infantry gradually reduced strong points. When the city fell in early February, approximately 1,000 German troops were captured or killed. Its fall opened the way for a westward advance into the heart of Pomerania and demonstrated that Soviet superiority in artillery and manpower would overwhelm local resistance, even at the cost of heavy destruction. Simultaneously, German units attempted to hold Schneidemühl, today Paiwa, a key transport hub with rail links across the region. Soviet 47th and 61st Armies launched repeated assaults beginning on 23 January, supported by tank brigades and massed artillery. The defenders, largely composed of ad hoc battle groups from the Second Army, fought tenaciously, turning the city into a fortress with barricades and strong points in stone buildings. The battle lasted into early February, ending only when Soviet forces cut the rail lines and encircled the city. Around 5,000 German troops surrendered, while the remainder attempted to break out westward in small groups. Schneidemühl's fall disrupted German communications and forced further withdrawals across central Pomerania. At the same time, the Red Army pressed toward Neustetten, Szczecinek, another important communication center. The Soviet 19th Army, reinforced with tank brigades, launched attacks through snow-covered forests and frozen lakes. German defenders, mainly from Volksgrenadier divisions, used the terrain to delay progress. Mines, ambushes, and sudden counterattacks slowed the Soviets, but by mid-February Neustetten was captured after street fighting. Soviet reports noted hundreds of destroyed or abandoned German vehicles and large numbers of civilian refugees in the town, evidence of the collapse of German control. One of the most dramatic early battles took place at Arnswald, Choszczno. Soviet forces had encircled the town by 31st January, trapping both civilians and the garrison. The Germans mounted a relief operation, led by Steiner's 11th SS Panzer Army. Elements of the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg reinforced by the 4th SS Polizei Division and units of the 163rd Infantry Division, broke through Soviet lines on 15 February. The counterattack reached the town, enabling the evacuation of roughly 3,000 civilians and wounded soldiers. For a brief moment, German propaganda celebrated the operation as proof that resistance in Pomerania could succeed. Yet the success was short-lived. Within days, Soviet forces re-encircled Arnswald, which fell after renewed assaults. The episode illustrated both the potential and the limitations of German counterattacks. They could achieve local relief, but could not alter the broader strategic balance. As February progressed, the Soviets continued to close in on key strongholds. Kolberg, Kołobrzeg, designated a fortress city by Hitler, was prepared for prolonged defense. German engineers reinforced coastal batteries, barricaded streets, and deployed anti-aircraft guns for ground fire. By early March, Soviet and Polish units moved against the city, beginning a siege that would last until 18th of March. Fighting here was particularly intense, with the Polish First Army playing a prominent role in assaults supported by Soviet artillery and air units. German defenders, numbering about 12,000, including elements of the 33rd Infantry Division and naval personnel, resisted fiercely. Street-by-street combat raged, with significant civilian casualties and widespread destruction. The eventual fall of Kolberg deprived Germany of one of its last Baltic ports for evacuation and cut another vital lifeline. Throughout February and early March, German resistance in towns like Stargard, Köslin, and Belgard demonstrated the determination to hold key points despite encirclement risks. Soviet reports emphasized the systematic reduction of strongpoints, artillery bombardments, assaults by infantry with flamethrowers and demolition charges, and armored thrusts through urban streets. Civilians endured bombardments, shortages of food, and mass evacuations under fire. Each Soviet gain brought further displacement, with refugees flooding roads toward Danzig and Gotenhofen. Morale on both sides fluctuated with each clash. For Soviet troops, victories reinforced the sense that the destruction of German forces in Pomerania was inevitable, but the bitter resistance in towns reminded commanders that urban combat would remain costly. German soldiers, many conscripts or Volkssturm, fought with a mixture of discipline and desperation, motivated in part by fear of Soviet retribution and the desire to protect retreating civilians. Propaganda amplified every local success, such as the temporary relief of Arnswald, but the overall trend was one of retreat and loss. Unexpected outcomes added complexity to the early engagements. While Soviet advances were generally steady, the German counterattacks around Stargard and Arnswalde briefly disrupted their timetable, forcing Rokossovsky to commit reserves earlier than planned. For the Germans, these actions bought only weeks of delay, but enabled the evacuation of additional civilians through Baltic ports. The civilians themselves, moving westward in endless streams, bore the brunt of the campaign's human cost. Their presence on the road slowed German troop movements and became a constant factor in Soviet operational planning. By early March 1945, the pattern of the first engagements had been established. Soviet forces steadily capturing key towns, German units mounting localized counterattacks, and civilians caught in between. The front lines shifted inexorably westward, each battle further weakening Army Group Vistula. The initial clashes set the stage for the escalation that would follow, as larger Soviet operations aimed to crush the remaining German forces in Pomerania and secure the entire Baltic coastline, ensuring that no threat remained to the northern flank of the Berlin offensive. As March 1945 unfolded, the Battle of Pomerania entered a phase of escalation that stretched the resources of both Soviet and German forces. The intensity of combat increased as the Red Army moved deeper into the region, facing stiffening resistance from Army Group Vistula. What had begun as a series of encirclements and local battles now expanded into a broad campaign that drew in more formations, lengthened the front, and created crises for both military and civilians caught in the path of war. The German command attempted to stabilize the situation by launching a larger counteroffensive in mid-February, coordinated by Felix Steiner's 11th SS Panzer Army. The aim was ambitious, to strike from Stargard and Stettin in the direction of Kustrin. with the goal of cutting Soviet spearheads on the Oder and relieving pressure on Berlin's approaches. The German plan called for the concentration of armored and infantry units, including remnants of the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, the 4th SS Polizei Division, and several Volksgrenadier divisions. In total, Steiner had perhaps 5,000–6,000 troops under his immediate command, though many divisions were badly under strength and equipped with only a fraction of their authorized tanks. On the 16th of February, the Germans launched their counterattack near Stargard. Initial gains surprised the Soviet forward elements, pushing back units of the 61st and 2nd Guards tank armies. The Germans retook several villages and briefly threatened Soviet supply lines. However, the Red Army quickly reinforced the sector. Rokossovsky committed fresh reserves, including mechanized brigades and heavy artillery concentrations. Within days, the German offensive lost momentum. Fuel shortages crippled mobility, and Soviet counterblows forced Steiner's formations back to their start positions by the end of the month. Though the offensive failed, it demonstrated that Army Group Vistula could still mount local strikes, compelling the Soviets to proceed more methodically in their advance. The crisis also had a political dimension. Hitler continued to insist that fortress cities such as Kolberg, Danzig, and Gotenhafen be held at all costs, tying down German units that might otherwise have been withdrawn to strengthen defenses on the Oder. Commanders in the field, already struggling with limited resources, were compelled to disperse their forces across a wide front. Civilian evacuations further strained German capacity. Hundreds of thousands sought passage westward on ships during Operation Hannibal, and the defense of Baltic ports became essential to protect these embarkation points. In practice, this meant that formations were locked into defensive battles they had little chance of winning, while Soviet forces pressed relentlessly from multiple directions. For the Soviets, escalation required careful coordination across fronts. Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian Front worked in conjunction with Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front, which advanced northward from the Oder. The aim was to compress German positions into ever smaller pockets. Logistics posed challenges as Soviet supply lines extended back to the Vistula and had to support large numbers of artillery pieces, tanks, and aircraft. The weather compounded difficulties. March brought thawing snow, turning roads into mud and reducing mobility. Soviet engineers labored to maintain crossings over rivers and to repair roads for heavy traffic. Despite these obstacles, the Red Army pressed forward, applying overwhelming artillery and airstrikes against German strongpoints. Casualty figures mounted steadily during this phase. Soviet reports estimated tens of thousands of German troops captured in encirclements around towns such as Stargard, Arnswald, and Köslin. German losses also included large numbers of civilians caught in bombardments or during chaotic evacuations. Soviet losses were significant as well, particularly in infantry units storming fortified towns. Although the Red Army maintained overall numerical superiority, its commanders were aware of the cost of repeated urban assaults and sought to combine encirclement tactics with direct attacks to minimize losses where possible. Terrain and weather played critical roles in shaping the battles. Pomerania's lakes, rivers, and forests provided natural defensive lines that German commanders exploited. The thaw created marshy ground, complicating tank maneuvers and forcing Soviet armored units onto narrow roads where ambushes could be staged. In some cases, German defenders used these conditions effectively to delay advances, but they could not hold indefinitely without reinforcements and fuel. The Soviets, with greater artillery reserves and air support, gradually overcame these obstacles, but at the price of slower progress than initially planned. The civilian crisis deepened with the escalation of combat. Refugee columns stretched across the countryside, vulnerable to air attacks, artillery fire, and the chaos of retreat. German authorities organized convoys to Baltic ports, but overcrowding and poor conditions led to widespread suffering. Ships such as the Wilhelm Gustloff and the Goya, already part of Operation Hannibal, carried tens of thousands of refugees, soldiers, and wounded westward, though the risk of sinking by Soviet submarines remained high. In towns still under German control, food shortages became acute, and local administrations struggled to maintain order amid the constant influx of displaced persons. Internationally, the The battles in Pomerania received less attention than the larger offensives aimed directly at Berlin, but they influenced Allied strategic perceptions. Western observers noted the determination with which the Soviets were clearing their flanks before the final assault on the German capital. At the same time, reports of mass civilian evacuations highlighted the scale of upheaval sweeping across eastern Germany in the war's final months. By the end of March 1945, escalation had produced both progress and crisis. The Soviets had advanced deep into Pomerania, capturing key towns and pressing toward the Baltic coast, but they faced stubborn resistance in fortress cities like Kolberg and Danzig. The Germans, though unable to halt the overall Soviet advance, demonstrated their ability to launch counterattacks and impose delays. Civilians bore the heaviest burden, as refugee movements, bombardments, and shortages created a humanitarian disaster on a massive scale. The stage was now set for the campaign's peak, when the heaviest battles would decide the fate of northern Germany's coastline and seal the collapse of Army Group Vistula. At the height of the Pomeranian campaign in March 1945, the battles reached their most intense phase, combining large-scale offensives, stubborn urban sieges, and desperate defensive actions. Both sides threw significant resources into the struggle, aware that the outcome would decisively shape the northern flank of the war's final stage. For the Red Army, the aim was to clear the entire region, secure the Baltic ports, and eliminate Army Group Vistula as a fighting force. For the Germans, the priority was to delay the Soviet advance, preserve evacuation routes, and hold symbolic strongpoints designated as fortresses by Hitler. The campaign peaked in violence, duration, and destruction during these weeks, with cities such as Kolberg, Danzig, and Gotenhofen becoming focal points of combat. One of the largest operations during this stage centered on Kolberg, Kołobrzeg. Declared a fortress city in March 1945, it was heavily fortified with barricades, bunkers, and artillery positions adapted from coastal defenses. The garrison, numbering roughly 15,000 men, included remnants of the 33rd Infantry Division, naval personnel, and Volkssturm units. They were reinforced by thousands of civilians who were pressed into constructing fortifications. Against them stood the Polish First Army, commanded by General Stanisław Popławski, and supported by Soviet artillery and air units. The battle began on the 4th of March with mass bombardments. Street fighting ensued, with Soviet and Polish infantry advancing house by house. Flamethrowers, demolition charges, and tanks were employed to dislodge defenders from strongpoints. Civilians were trapped amid the ruins, enduring bombardment and shortages of food and water. The defenders held out for 2 weeks, but by 18th March, Soviet-Polish forces captured the city. Around 2,300 German soldiers were taken prisoner, while thousands of civilians were evacuated by sea during the siege. Kolberg's fall deprived Germany of one of its last Baltic ports and marked a major symbolic gain for the Polish forces participating in the liberation of territory claimed as part of post-war Poland. Simultaneously, the Soviets pressed toward Danzig, Gdansk, and Gotenhofen, Gdynia, two of the largest ports in West Prussia. These cities, defended by the German Second Army under General Walter Weiss, were crucial for Operation Hannibal, the massive evacuation effort moving soldiers and civilians by sea to western Germany. By early March, Rokossovsky's forces, spearheaded by the 2nd Shock and 65th Armies, advanced from the east, while the 70th and 49th Armies closed from the south. On 19th of March, Soviet troops reached the outskirts of Danzig, launching a systematic assault supported by more than 1,000 artillery pieces. The Germans defended with approximately 4,000 troops, reinforced by naval guns and coastal artillery. The fighting was fierce, with entire districts reduced to rubble by bombardment. On 30th March, after 11 days of combat, Danzig fell. Around 1,000 German soldiers were killed, 15,000 captured, and tens of thousands of civilians evacuated by sea under heavy fire. The capture of Gotenhofen followed soon after, on 28th of March. Here, Soviet 19th Army units fought through strong naval defenses, overcoming bunkers and artillery emplacements along the coast. German naval personnel and fortress troops, numbering around 3,000, mounted a determined defense. but Soviet artillery bombardments and infantry assaults gradually forced a retreat toward the docks. Thousands of civilians crowded the harbor, boarding evacuation ships under constant artillery and air attacks. Despite the desperate circumstances, more than 2,000 civilians and soldiers were evacuated from Danzig and Gotenhafen in the final weeks, one of the largest maritime evacuations in history. Still, the loss of both ports cut off further large-scale movements and sealed the fate of German forces trapped in Pomerania. Further inland, battles for smaller towns also reached their peak intensity. Stargard Sechachinski, defended by elements of the 163rd Infantry Division, and Volkssturm, was assaulted in late February by units of the Soviet 61st Army. The city was encircled, and after 3 days of heavy fighting, it was captured, with approximately 3,000 German prisoners taken. Kozelin, another strong point, fell after a week-long battle in early March, further unraveling German defenses. Each of these captures added to Soviet momentum and brought more territory under their control, but the cost was high in casualties, particularly in house-to-house fighting. At the operational level, the Red Army employed its full spectrum of firepower. Artillery barrages of unprecedented density preceded most attacks, with as many as 200 guns per kilometer of front in key sectors. The 2nd Guards Tank Army and Mechanized Corps exploited breakthroughs, encircling German units and cutting supply lines. The Soviet Air Force, though constrained by weather at times, provided close support, bombing German positions and targeting convoys heading for the coast. German defenders, lacking comparable reserves, relied on fortified strongpoints, local counterattacks, and terrain advantages to delay the Soviet advance. However, shortages of fuel and ammunition made sustained defense impossible. For the Germans, the peak of the campaign also meant the collapse of coherent command. Army Group Vistula, still under Himmler's nominal leadership until his removal in March, struggled to coordinate. The appointment of Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici to command the Oder defenses reflected recognition of the dire situation, but in Pomerania itself, local commanders acted largely independently, focusing on evacuation and delaying tactics rather than coordinated defense. Hitler's insistence on holding fortress cities at all costs consumed men and resources, preventing organized withdrawal to more defensible positions. Civilian suffering reached its height in this period. Refugees crowded into Danzig, Gotenhafen, and Kolberg, overwhelming food supplies and medical facilities. Many were forced to remain during sieges, enduring bombardment and close combat. The Baltic evacuation saved hundreds of thousands but left many others behind. The sinking of ships such as the Wilhelm Gustloff and Goya during this period highlighted the dangers. Tens of thousands of lives were lost in maritime disasters caused by submarine attacks on overcrowded evacuation vessels. Those who remained in captured cities faced destruction, shortages, and the uncertainties of occupation. The peak of the Pomeranian campaign thus combined the largest military operations of the region with the heaviest civilian impact. By the end of March 1945, most of Pomerania had fallen to the Soviets and Polish forces. The German Second Army was shattered, its remnants retreating toward Mecklenburg or absorbed into defensive lines along the Oder. The Soviet capture of Danzig and Gotenhafen marked the definitive end of German control of the Baltic coast east of Stettin, sealing the region's fate. The campaign reached its climax in destruction, evacuation, and collapse, setting the stage for the final turning point as the Red Army completed the elimination of German forces in Pomerania and prepared to launch the decisive Berlin offensive. As April 1945 approached, the German forces remaining in Pomerania shifted from organized defense to improvised resistance and adaptation. The peak battles for Kolberg, Danzig, and Gotenhafen had already broken the backbone of the Second Army, yet remnants of units continued to fight in scattered pockets. The emphasis now lay on maintaining corridors for retreat and evacuation, delaying Soviet advances where possible, and improvising with dwindling resources. For the Soviets and their Polish allies, this phase demanded new tactics as the enemy dissolved into smaller formations, forcing them to adapt their methods of pursuit and suppression. Resistance centered on fortified towns and natural obstacles. The Germans transformed rivers such as the Oder's tributaries and Pomerania's lakes into defensive lines, deploying what remained of Volksgrenadier and SS formations. In early April, isolated strongpoints at Swinemünde, Stettin, and smaller coastal towns became the focus of resistance. Many defenders were not regular army, but Volkssturm militia, naval personnel reassigned to infantry roles, and police units hastily integrated into combat groups. Their equipment was often outdated, captured artillery pieces, limited numbers of machine guns, and Panzerfausts were distributed widely. Despite these limitations, local commanders attempted to impose delays through ambushes, demolitions, and rearguard actions. The Red Army, having captured the major Baltic ports, now sought to eliminate resistance systematically. Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front pressed northwest towards Stettin and the lower Oder, while Polish units were assigned to clear coastal areas and secure newly captured cities. Rather than massed assaults against strong urban fortifications, the Soviets often relied on encirclement and attrition, isolating German groups before crushing them with concentrated artillery. Engineers and infantry adapted to fighting across flooded ground and through ruined infrastructure, while tank units shifted toward rapid exploitation in areas where resistance was thinner. Improvisation was crucial for both sides. German defenders made use of terrain, laying mines across swampy tracks and forest paths, erecting barricades in small villages, and using hidden artillery for sudden fire against Soviet spearheads. Soviet forces, in turn, adapted by increasing reliance on reconnaissance units, deploying light infantry screens to detect ambushes, and employing captured bridges or pontoon equipment to cross rivers quickly. Commanders recognized that time, rather than territory, was the Germans' main resource, and every day of delay was bought with men and materiel. The psychological toll during this phase was severe. German soldiers, many of them teenagers, conscripted into Volkssturm, or older men unfit for regular service, faced overwhelming odds and little prospect of survival. Desertion and surrender increased steadily, though pockets of fanatical resistance remained, particularly among SS units. Soviet troops, though victorious, endured constant combat fatigue from weeks of urban fighting and rapid advances. The pressure to complete the clearing of Pomerania before the Berlin offensive left little room for rest. Civilians, trapped between retreat and occupation, suffered continuous upheaval. Those who had not escaped earlier now faced shortages of food, medical supplies, and shelter amid widespread devastation. Polish forces played a growing role in resistance suppression. The Polish First Army, under Soviet command, was tasked with securing coastal areas and clearing German garrisons along the Baltic. This provided both a symbolic and practical outcome. Polish troops fought for territories that would soon be incorporated into post-war Poland. Their participation reinforced Soviet claims of liberation, though it also highlighted the shifting demographic reality, as German civilians were expelled and Polish settlers prepared to move into devastated cities like Szczecin and Gdansk. By mid-April, organized German resistance in Pomerania had largely collapsed, yet scattered fighting continued in the coastal enclaves, delaying complete Soviet control until the end of the month. These final battles reflected the adaptation of warfare at the lowest level. Small units defending isolated strongpoints, civilians improvising survival strategies in ruined towns, and Soviet and Polish troops adjusting to the challenges of mopping up rather than breaking through. Resistance had lost strategic significance, but it prolonged suffering for both soldiers and civilians, leaving behind a region devastated by weeks of fighting, evacuations, and destruction. This phase demonstrated how the conflict in Pomerania evolved from large-scale clashes into a war of attrition and adaptation, a prelude to the final turning point when Soviet forces would complete the destruction of German military presence in the region and turn fully to the assault on Berlin. The turning point of the Pomeranian campaign came in late March and early April 1945, when the last major German strongholds were broken and the Red Army secured the entire Baltic coastline east of the Oder. Until then, Army Group Vistula had hoped to maintain a line of resistance anchored on Stettin and the coastal ports, But the loss of Danzig and Gotenhafen destroyed the logistical foundation of any prolonged defense. From this moment, the balance of the campaign shifted irreversibly, with German formations no longer able to function as cohesive armies, and the Soviets able to redirect their full strength toward the Oder and the Berlin Axis. The critical battle was the capture of Danzig between 19 and 30th of March. This operation sealed the fate of the German Second Army. Once Danzig fell, evacuation routes narrowed, and remnants of German forces were forced either into desperate attempts to reach the coast or into retreat westward toward Mecklenburg. The simultaneous fall of Gotenhofen removed the last major embarkation point. Together, these defeats represented the collapse of the German northern flank. Tens of thousands of soldiers were captured, while others fled in fragmented groups, often abandoning heavy equipment and attempting to blend with refugee columns. For the Soviets, these victories meant that the danger of a German counterstroke into Zhukov's flank was eliminated. The Red Army could now concentrate entirely on preparations for the Berlin offensive, confident that Pomerania no longer harbored the reserves or infrastructure capable of mounting significant resistance. Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front, having achieved its mission, began redeploying westward to join the assaults across the Oder. The transfer of these forces was itself a sign of the turning point. Resources once tied down in Pomerania were now free to support the decisive blow against Berlin. German morale collapsed as news of the coastal losses spread. Fortress commanders who had been ordered to fight to the last faced impossible choices, with some surrendering once encircled and others attempting futile last stands. The civilian population, deprived of escape routes, endured the consequences. Refugees crowded into remaining towns such as Stettin, where overcrowding, food shortages, and bombardments created chaos. The sense that Pomerania had been lost was reinforced by the rapid Soviet advance across the region, compressing remaining German defenders into small, isolated pockets. The repercussions extended beyond military operations. Operation Hannibal, which had evacuated more than 1 million civilians and soldiers by March, slowed dramatically after the loss of Danzig and Gotenhofen. While smaller ports continued to function briefly, the scale of evacuation diminished. Tens of thousands who might have escaped earlier were trapped, contributing to higher numbers of civilian casualties in the campaign's final weeks. The sudden shift from organized withdrawal to collapse marked a decisive turning point not only for the armies but for the civilian fate of the region. Politically, the turning point cemented Soviet and Polish control of territories that would form post-war Western Poland. The participation of the Polish First Army in the final reduction of Kolberg and in securing coastal sectors gave the Soviet Union leverage in shaping the post-war settlement. The removal of German authority in Pomerania before the arrival of Western Allied forces ensured that this part of Europe fell firmly into the Soviet sphere. By the first week of April, the German Second Army existed only as scattered units retreating toward the Elbe, or absorbed into ad hoc defenses along the Oder. Army Group Vistula no longer had the strength to threaten Soviet operations. The campaign's turning point was thus defined not by a single dramatic battle, but by a sequence of collapses that destroyed German capacity to resist in Pomerania and freed Soviet forces for the decisive campaign in Berlin. For soldiers and civilians alike, it was the moment when resistance shifted from difficult but possible to futile, and when the fate of the region and the war in northern Germany was sealed. The aftermath of the Pomeranian campaign unfolded between April and early May 1945, as Soviet and Polish forces completed the clearance of remaining German positions, and the remnants of Army Group Vistula disintegrated. The combat operations that had dominated February and March gave way to mopping up actions, mass surrenders, and the humanitarian consequences of months of siege, bombardment, and evacuation. The Second Belarusian Front secured its objectives and prepared for redeployment to the Oder, while German survivors attempted to escape westward in fragmented formations, often colliding with waves of refugees and devastated landscapes. In Stettin, now Szczecin, the last significant German stronghold in western Pomerania, Soviet forces launched a final push in mid-April. The garrison, comprised of remnants of the 163rd Infantry Division, Volkssturm battalions, and police units initially resisted with around 15,000 men. However, shortages of ammunition and the collapse of neighboring defenses made prolonged resistance impossible. After heavy artillery bombardments and several days of street fighting, the defenders surrendered on 26 April. The fall of Stettin effectively ended organized German resistance in Pomerania. Soviet forces captured thousands of prisoners, while surviving civilians faced immediate challenges of food shortages, destruction of housing, and the uncertainties of Soviet occupation. Elsewhere, scattered German pockets continued to hold out. In coastal enclaves such as Swinemünde, Świnoujście, and smaller islands along the Baltic, garrisons fought delaying actions to cover evacuations by sea. Operation Hannibal, which had already evacuated more than 1 million people from East Prussia and Pomerania earlier in 1945, continued at reduced scale, with ships carrying tens of thousands westward until the final days of April. Yet, with Danzig and Gotenhafen already lost, the capacity for mass evacuation was gone. Thousands who remained in ports at the time of capture were taken prisoner, while many others perished in overcrowded convoys attacked from the air and sea. The retreat of German forces westward created chaos across the countryside. Columns of soldiers mixed with refugees clogged the few intact roads, often under Soviet artillery fire. Abandoned vehicles, burned wagons, and discarded equipment lined the routes. Many Wehrmacht units attempted to break through toward Mecklenburg, hoping to surrender to advancing British forces rather than the Soviets. Some succeeded in reaching the Elbe, but many were cut off and captured in Pomerania. The remnants of the Second Army, which had numbered more than 2,000 men at the beginning of February, were reduced to scattered groups by May, with tens of thousands taken prisoner. For civilians, the immediate aftermath was catastrophic. Refugee flows turned into stationary populations trapped in ruined towns once the evacuation routes closed. Hunger and disease spread rapidly. Contemporary reports noted outbreaks of typhus and dysentery in areas where sanitation had collapsed. Families that had abandoned their homes earlier often found themselves unable to travel further, while those who remained during the sieges faced devastation of housing, industry, and infrastructure. Entire districts of Danzig, Kolberg, and Stettin were left in ruins, with casualties numbering in the tens of thousands. Soviet and Polish authorities quickly moved to establish control. Polish military and administrative units began taking responsibility for territories designated as part of post-war Poland. The Polish First Army secured coastal cities, while provisional Polish authorities began organizing food distribution, housing allocation, and the establishment of new administrations. For the German population, this marked the beginning of expulsions and forced relocations. Between May and the end of 1947, hundreds of thousands of Germans were expelled from Pomerania, replaced by Polish settlers, many of whom had been displaced from areas annexed by the Soviet Union in the east. The humanitarian crisis overlapped with the final military operations. While Soviet units redeployed for the Berlin offensive, rear area troops remained in Pomerania to disarm surrendered German soldiers, secure supply depots, and clear mines. The region was heavily mined during the campaign, with thousands of explosives scattered across roads, fields, and towns. Clearing these hazards was a slow process, resulting in further casualties even after formal fighting ended. By early May 1945, Pomerania was firmly under Soviet and Polish control. The collapse of organized German resistance, the mass surrender of troops, and the humanitarian devastation marked the campaign's conclusion. Immediate consequences included the displacement of millions, the destruction of cities and infrastructure, and the complete military defeat of the German Second Army. The region's integration into Poland and the forced migration of its German inhabitants would continue for years, shaping the long-term demographic and political reality of Central Europe. The aftermath of the Pomeranian campaign thus combined the end of combat operations with the beginning of a profound social and territorial transformation. The legacy of the Battle of Pomerania extended far beyond the military outcome of February-April 1945. It shaped the final phase of the war in Europe, determined the post-war settlement of northern and western Poland, and left enduring marks on the collective memory of Germany, Poland, and the Soviet Union. As a campaign, It demonstrated the decisive impact of flank security on large-scale offensives, the humanitarian consequences of forced population movements, and the political implications of territorial conquest in the last months of the Second World War. From a military perspective, the Soviet success in Pomerania cleared the way for the Berlin offensive. By eliminating Army Group Vistula as an effective force and capturing Danzig, Gotenhafen, Kolberg, and Stettin, the Red Army secured its northern flank. This allowed Stavka to concentrate overwhelming forces against Berlin without fear of counterattack from the north. The campaign also highlighted the growing effectiveness of Soviet operational art in 1945. The coordination of multiple fronts, the integration of artillery, armor, and infantry, and the use of Polish allies in politically significant operations. For the Germans, the failure underscored the futility of defending extended lines and the limitations of fortress strategy. Despite Hitler's orders, cities declared fortresses fell one by one, consuming manpower and equipment without altering the strategic balance. Politically, the outcome of the campaign shaped the post-war map of Central Europe. By conquering Pomerania before Western Allied forces advanced into northern Germany, the Soviets ensured that the region would fall under their influence. At the Potsdam Conference later in 1945, Pomerania, east of the Oder-Neisse line, was formally transferred to Poland. This territorial shift was accompanied by one of the largest forced migrations in modern history. The expulsion of the German population and the resettlement of Poles from territories annexed by the Soviet Union. Thus, the campaign's conclusion marked both the end of German Pomerania and the beginning of Polish Pomerania, a transformation that permanently altered the region's demographic and cultural identity. For civilians, the legacy was shaped by memory of flight, loss, and displacement. German accounts emphasized the refugee columns, the overcrowded ports, and the maritime disasters that accompanied Operation Hannibal. Soviet and Polish narratives, by contrast, stressed the liberation of territory and the restoration of Poland's western frontier. These conflicting perspectives reveal the contested memory of the campaign, a humanitarian catastrophe for some, a national rebirth for others, and a demonstration of military power for the Soviet Union. Historiographically, the Battle of Pomerania long remained overshadowed by larger campaigns such as the Vistula-Oder Offensive and the Battle of Berlin. Yet, recent scholarship has recognized its significance in explaining how the Red Army secured its strategic position before the final assault. The campaign also offers insights into the interaction between military operations and civilian displacement, showing how strategic decisions about fortresses and evacuation shaped human outcomes. The evacuation through Baltic ports, though one of the largest in history, could not prevent massive civilian casualties and dislocation, illustrating the limits of military planning under conditions of total collapse. Culturally, the campaign left enduring traces in the cities themselves. Kolberg, Danzig, and Stettin were rebuilt after the war, often in ways that reflected new political realities rather than their pre-war German character. In Poland, the battles became part of a national narrative of victory and reclamation, celebrated through monuments and commemorations. In Germany, memories of Pomerania were carried by expellee communities, whose recollections of flight and loss shaped post-war discourse on displacement and territorial changes. In the Soviet Union, the campaign was presented as a demonstration of military efficiency and as evidence of Soviet commitment to aiding its Polish ally. In the broader context of the Second World War, the Battle of Pomerania epitomized the final unraveling of the German war effort. The loss of the region deprived the Reich of vital ports, destroyed its northern armies, and accelerated the collapse of its defensive capacity. For the Allies, it confirmed that the end of the war in Europe was imminent. Within weeks of Pomerania's fall, Soviet troops entered Berlin, and Germany surrendered unconditionally. The historical significance of the campaign lies not only in its role in clearing the path to Berlin, but also in its long-term consequences for Central Europe. It set the stage for post-war border changes, mass expulsions, and the integration of Poland into the Soviet sphere. Its memory remains contested, interpreted through national experiences of victory, loss, and transformation. The Battle of Pomerania thus stands as both a decisive military operation and a moment of profound geopolitical and human change, marking the transition from war to a new post-war order in Europe.